Hello, Peter Carson here. It's 1 o'clock Eastern Time. We're just set to get rolling here with our second in our webinar series. Today's topic is on site provisioning and integration with Masthead Global Navigation. I'm going to be speaking through the hour today. Actually, it might be a little bit less than an hour. It's a briefer topic. We may give a little time back to you as part of the day today. Just for introductions, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We are recording today's session, so if you've got colleagues who aren't able to join us and attend, we will be posting up a recording as well as the slide deck up on the event page, probably over the next day or two once we get that ready and posted up. All my contact information is in there, so you'll have that all available to you. I want to spend a minute, do a quick introduction, background on Extranet User Manager. We are a ISV solution, and really our approach is around how do we manage people who are external to your organization. It's all about how do you build an external community. So we're going to be talking about that in the context of how do you manage sites in SharePoint Online and tying in Masthead from a global navigation point of view as well. A little background history on Extranet User Manager. It goes back about 10 years as a bespoke custom-built solution we'd created for a number of our clients. And about 5-6 years ago, we productized that and started to promote that as a standalone product. 2014, we added support for Office 365, which we're going to be looking at today. And 3 years ago, we launched it out as its own standalone brand and really started promoting it as a standalone product. We introduced a channel partner program last year. I actually need to update this slide. We've got a number of interesting new releases out this year around broader OpenID Connect and SAML support from a single sign-on point of view. Save that for another day, though. It's getting a little too technical for today's topic. We have clients around both North America and worldwide. Actually, I think we're a little north of 75 plus customers deployed globally now across a wide spectrum of industries. Now, I mentioned this is the second in a series. We've got a 3-part series. We started last week with Masthead, talking about global navigation and why it's important in your Office 365 SharePoint Online sites. Today, we're going to be talking about how you manage those sites, how you put together some governance and site provisioning process around that, and how Extranet User Manager can be part of that, but also how Masthead and global navigation can fit into that. Later this week on Thursday, we're actually going to have Tygraph talking about how to analyze that. Tygraph is another partner of ours who's created an amazing Power BI dashboard for looking at how you're using your Office 365, not just from a SharePoint point of view, but across the entire spectrum of Office 365 products. So that'll be this Thursday from noon until 1 Eastern Standard Time. All right, so let's start a little background. I'm sure pretty much everybody's familiar with SharePoint. SharePoint Online, you know, it's a place to communicate and collaborate. It's often a place for the corporate intranet, but also team sites from a collaboration point of view, and maybe forms and workflows as part of that as well. I like to think of it as really 3 places to work. You know, the first being the OneDrive for business. You know, these are personal files that are private by default. You can share them out externally, either with members of your organization or even with external people, depending on what permissions have been set up in your tenant, but it's really by default intended to be private. Team sites are intended to share content within your group. Again, it can be shared out externally, but they're really collaboration spaces. We're going to talk more about Office 365 groups and Microsoft Teams and how that all fits together as well. And then lastly, we've got communication sites, which are really, you know, how do I publish information out to a broader audience? How do I inform and engage in a very rich visual kind of way? So we're going to focus mainly on the middle portion, the team site side of things. That's typically where we see the most need for governance. That's where the most sort of ad hoc sites get spun up from that point of view. So SharePoint team sites have been around right back to the original 2001 version of SharePoint, and they've morphed and changed, but there's sort of some common themes around there. You know, we've got document library, we've got a OneNote notebook, we've got a home page for the site. You know, by default, all members are content authors. This is intended as a collaboration space, not as a publishing space. So all members of the team are contributing and collaborating as well as consuming content from the site. We often see in an intranet scenario that organizations spin up team sites for each of the departments as their private working area, but you might have committee sites, board of director sites, project sites that are cross-functional or maybe even external, because there is the ability to set up external sharing with clients, vendors, partners, and such from that, but very collaboration focused. Now, last week, Masthead took us through how they can layer a global navigation across that and provide a common and consistent navigation across your entire collection of sites. And this becomes really important in the modern site days that we're seeing now in Office 365 and soon to be in SharePoint 2019 as well, where every site ends up being its own site collection. So it's a very flat structure. And Alec, as he was taking through the presentation last week, if you haven't seen it, we do have a recorded version up on our event page for you to look at. You know, he did a very nice job of walking us through the whole navigation story. You know, what navigation is there within a site itself? What's provided from hub sites, which are a more recent addition from Microsoft in terms of how we collect a number of sites together, and then how Masthead provides a global navigation across all of that. So, I mean, in this particular screenshot we have here, we can see underneath the studio here is actually the site navigation for the site that I'm currently in here. Above that, where it says the studio and from the bridge business process, that's actually an example of hub-provided navigation by Microsoft. And then the top area where we see Masthead is actually the Masthead global navigation. Now, you wouldn't normally want 3 different navs across here. Masthead was just illustrating the point of, you know, where do each of these navigations fit in and how do they look across that spectrum. And it's really that global navigation that we're going to be focusing on through here. Now, under the hood, Masthead provides some interesting ability to install Masthead onto your SharePoint Online, to manage your navigation and to manage your organization. You don't have to apply it to every site within your organization. You get to choose which sites you apply it to. So you use their editor to build out the navigation, both from a left and right, as well as a footer point of view. You can define some themes around logos and colors and such. And then you decide which sites you want to turn that on. So you can enable or disable it through each of the sites. So that was the quick and dirty recap. If you missed last week's session, I wanted to bring people up to speed on what Masthead was and what gaps it's looking to fill as part of that. I'm going to take a quick pause here. I do want to get a sense from the attendees in terms of what their background is from a SharePoint point of view. So I'm going to put a couple of polls up here. Give me 1 sec to launch those out. So the first one was just to get a sense of, you know, who's in Office 365 versus who's still on premise, either from a 2016, 2013, earlier version of SharePoint. So I'll leave this open for a bit if we just have people respond back as part of that. Okay, we've got almost everybody there. Let me actually share that back. Let me close that and share it out. So not surprisingly, given the topic here, almost everybody's on Office 365. So that's awesome to see. I mean, we're seeing more and more adoption of Office 365 as time goes by, particularly here in Canada. Now that we've got the Canadian data centers open for a couple of years, you know, a lot of adoption from that point of view. A few folks still on earlier versions. A lot of what we're going to be talking about here, you know, Masthead could be deployed to SharePoint 2016. I believe it could even be deployed to 2013. I'm not positive on that. Actually, sorry, no, I believe it is 2016 is the only on-premise version that it supports. So there is application from that point of view. And certainly the site provisioning that we're going to be talking about applies to 2013 and 2016 on-premise as well. So one more poll that I want to show here. Let me just share this one out. This just, you know, irrespective of which version or whether you're cloud or on-premise, getting a sense of how you currently use SharePoint. You know, is it strictly for internal collaboration? Do you know any sort of internal web publishing from an intranet point of view? Do you have an existing extranet or public-facing website on SharePoint? All right, let me just close that out and go ahead and share that. So this is pretty typical. I mean, almost everybody uses it from an internal collaboration point of view. Fairly high proportion, more than half using it from an internet point of view and quite a few from an extranet. So I'm assuming that's by nature of our product being part of the pitch here. There's obviously an interest from an extranet's point of view. A couple folks using it from a public-facing website. We're seeing less and less of that directly on SharePoint, although we've been doing more and more projects where we're still using SharePoint as a content management system for public-facing websites, but then actually publishing that up onto an Azure website. So it's an interesting cloud hybrid where you can still have a fully cloud solution managed by Microsoft for that. Cool. Well, thank you for your feedback. That gives me some guidance in terms of who's using what from that point of view. Okay, so let's come back to our deck here. And what I want to do now is dive into project sites. And this is actually a topic that I've been giving for quite a few years. In fact, I've got a wish list that I wrote back in 2015, so 3 years ago now, of what I wanted to see in a project management site from Microsoft. You know, I was a big fan of using team sites, and Office 365 groups were just starting to come out. They had some odd things in there. It wasn't really a full SharePoint site. So I put this together and said, okay, I like where Microsoft's going, and we'll talk more about what Office 365 groups are, but I like this idea of being able to tie in email and calendar from Exchange into my project management site. Because, you know, regardless of if you've fully adopted Microsoft Teams or Slack or other styles of communication, I don't think email is completely going away. So there's a nice way of being able to track that into the project site. That's a great thing. And there's always meetings and events that happen from a project management point of view. Let's get some calendar support in there. Yes, you can do calendars in SharePoint natively. I just find it better in Exchange because it's where people live and work. You know, if you're inviting a bunch of people to a meeting, if you could just invite the project to the meeting as well and just have it recorded, that'd be the ideal way of doing that. I'm also a huge OneNote fan. OneNote's actually a free tool from Microsoft. It's part of the Office family, but it's freely downloadable. You don't need an Office license in order to use it. If you don't use it, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's an awesome way of tracking notes. And where it really becomes powerful is when you store that OneNote in SharePoint. Then it becomes shareable between everybody who's part of that team site. Literally in real time, I can have multiple people in the same note in OneNote, and they'll each see each other's keystrokes as they're working on the notes. Everything's up to date and live from a real-time point of view. Obviously, SharePoint from a document management point of view, you want to see the full SharePoint document libraries with full metadata, the ability to create custom lists, you know, things like tasks and issues and such from there, and then ultimately being able to share those with external users as well, because not everybody that's part of a project necessarily works for that organization. So how do we bring those external project members in? And even bring in external systems, things like finance, time tracking, bug tracking that may be part of the project that we want to expose through there. So as I mentioned, this I put together sort of in early days of Office 365 groups. That's become a really hot topic for Microsoft and one that's very successful for them. I quite like where they've gone from a strategy point of view. So this is actually a great slide. Alec shared it last week in his session. I already had it in my deck as well. I like to come back to it because it really does a nice job of explaining what an Office 365 group is. What this slide is illustrating is, depending on where you choose to create a group, you're going to get different things. So in the top are all the different places where you could choose to create a group. You could be in Yammer from an enterprise social point of view, in your Outlook Mail, in Planner, in SharePoint, in Stream from a video point of view, or the latest edition in Microsoft Teams, and choose to create a group from there. As you choose different tools to create the group in, you get different results coming back from that. Like if I choose to create a group from within Yammer, I'm going to get a Yammer feed as part of that, as well as all the core, you know, Planner, the SharePoint site, the OneNote, the Stream Video, the Power BI, as part of that Yammer Office 365 group. But you notice here we've got the blue section, the Outlook email and shared calendar. I only get those if I create the group through any of the other tools except Yammer. Because the idea is, well, if you chose to create it through Yammer, you don't want to use Outlook for your conversations, you want to use Yammer for your conversations. So it's making that decision of which tool you're going to use to communicate. If we come to SharePoint, where we're going to focus on today, I get all of those Office 365 pieces. I also get that shared inbox and the shared calendar. So that idea of being able to track emails, to track appointments and such related to, say, a project in a project site methodology, that's all done through Outlook and through Exchange, which works really well. And then the latest addition is Microsoft Teams. If you're familiar with Slack, this is very much a competitor to that. It's all about persistent chat and how you communicate with your other team members in an asynchronous kind of way. So it's not like instant messaging where the other person has to be there. You can chat with them. If they're not there when they come into Teams later, there's an activity feed that will show them, the conversations that they've missed. They'll be able to jump into things from there. So it's actually a great way of working. We've been adopting it at Envision IT and Extranet User Manager over the last 6 or 8 months. We've seen our internal email go almost completely off. Everything's moving to Teams from that point of view, and it just works really well from that perspective. So I create the group through Microsoft Teams. It's going to create a Teams wiki page and the team chat as part of that. Now, having said that, if I decided to, say, create my group through SharePoint and it didn't create a team, I can actually come back later in Teams and say, hey, I want to create a team and I want to attach it to this existing Office 365 group that's already there. So you do have that ability to bring it in after the fact as well. And in fact, there's still plans afoot within Microsoft that I created a standalone SharePoint site before Office 365 groups. They call it groupifying that. Can I turn it into an Office 365 group? It's not there yet. I expect we're going to be down in Orlando next week for Microsoft Ignite. I'm keen to see what their plans are there and how soon we're going to be seeing that functionality coming out as part of that. All right, so we've got all these different ways to create Office 365 groups. How do you want your users to do that? Well, I'm a strong fan of providing some guidance around that, some governance around that. So we've actually open sourced out a solution around site provisioning. So let me give you some background on what that looks like. It starts with a self-service form. The idea is that you still want it to be easy for end users to get sites created, but you want them to follow a standard procedure for doing that. You want your sites, if you've got site templates, have the appropriate templates associated with them, the appropriate people in there. You want to make sure that multiple members of a project don't each try and spin up a project site. You have multiple different sites for the same purpose. So that's where we get into things like approvals. There may be a requirement to say, hey, as part of the self-service form, before we go and do anything, it does need to come to a gatekeeper to approve that. We want to make sure that that's as simple as possible and it doesn't become a big hurdle, that person is swamped or that group is swamped and it can be a week or 2 weeks before people get their site. We want to make sure that that turns around very quickly. So we're going to talk about the technology and using Microsoft Flow from a workflows point of view to automate that process and also to bring in that approval step. It needs to be extensible and customizable. Every organization is going to be different in terms of what their requirements are. So I wanted to make it easy to tweak and tune to each particular organization. You want to be able to leverage out of the box site templates, but we also want to be able to provide the ability to create your own customized site templates. If you've got a particular set of libraries, content types, metadata, folders, even content itself that should go in every site that gets created, then let's make sure that we've got that ability to template that. Obviously, we want to make sure it's supporting modern sites and Office 365 groups. That's the direction that Microsoft's going in. And technically, we wanted to make sure we kept to the broadest possible audience from people that can implement this. So we wanted to make sure we didn't use Visual Studio or any sort of compiled code for this, no C#. It's all built around PowerShell and some configuration so that IT pros within your organization can really get their heads around it and can carry this forward, not just from an implementation point of view, but from an extensibility and customization point of view. So let's have a look at the technologies that we use for that. I mentioned Flow already. We also use Power Apps from a customizing in the form point of view, and then PowerShell is the main meat behind the scenes. It's doing all the work. So as I mentioned, the deck is up, or it's going to be up shortly on our event site. All the project documentation is there. So there's a GitHub site that has all the source code available as part of this. There's a full white paper that you can download. Takes you through step-by-step instructions. It's quite detailed. It's somewhere around 60 or 70 pages long, so don't get overwhelmed. But we put a lot of screenshots and explanations to make it easy as possible for people to get their head around how do they actually deploy this out. And there's some other articles related to it as well. If you look up on our resource article section on our Extranet User Manager site. And a lot of this came out of a client project that we did for Associated Engineering, where they had a already existing provisioning process around spinning up new projects for their organization, and we tweaked and adjusted that to work with Office 365. So what's under the hood? How's this hanging together? Well, we've got a SharePoint list that we use to track both the existing sites and any new site requests. When somebody wants a new site, basically they're entering an entry into that list. And rather than working directly with the SharePoint list, we put together a Power Apps form in front of that to make it a little easier. I'll show you what that looks like. As soon as that happens and that entry gets written to the list, Flow gets triggered to say, hey, I need to either go through an approval workflow or go ahead and build out this site. And Flow calls out to what's called an Azure Function App. It's the place that we host all the code for running the PowerShell scripts and such. And it's hosted up in Azure, provided by Microsoft, so they take care of all the plumbing and work around that. So let's switch over into demo mode and actually take you through what that looks like. So if I come over to my browser here, so if I was to start, let's go right up to the top of our site. So I begin at the beginning of our site. This is our Office 365 Internet home. We've got our news, we've got some quick links, we've got some staff links, we've got events that are going on, and up here we see our Masthead navigation as part of that here. One of the quick links we put into Masthead is a link over to what we call our landing site. And what this is, it's a place where we keep the list to manage and track all of the sites. So I can see all of the sites that are set up through here. I wouldn't normally navigate it this way. I'm going to show you different ways that we can navigate through this. So let's go into the See All and have a look at this list a little bit deeper. This view is just showing me the URL. So if I use the Modern Lists interface, switch the view over to all items, we can see what's behind that list. And the people that are using this, that are requesting new sites, would never care or look to this level of detail, but I want to give you a sense of what's happening under the hood. So each entry in the list here represents a site in the Office 365 tenant. You can see I've got a bunch of test runs I was doing as I was getting ready for the demo here. So we've got, what's the URL of the site? And we also have this concept of parent URL. This is an important concept that I want to stress here. So I mentioned at the beginning, with modern sites, Microsoft is going to this approach where every site is its own standalone site collection. So there's no hierarchy, there's no subsites. In fact, they're just rolled out some new features to even disable the ability to create subsites if you want to, because you really want to discourage your users from creating those subsites. But the reality is there's often still a hierarchy to the sites. Even though they're flat peers of each other, sites can belong to other sites through there. So the way we worked around that was said, well, let's create a concept of a parent URL for each site. And we can actually build up a breadcrumb. And we're going to show in a minute how we can actually integrate that into Masthead from a navigation point of view. So we can see this dry run site that I created just before the webinar started. Its parent URL is this site temp demos. But that in itself rolls up as well. So we can see here we've got our dry run 2 site that belongs to temporary demos, that lives under sales, that lives under the home of the site. So we've still got a deep hierarchy there, even though those sites are flat from a site collection point of view. And then we've got some tracking information, when was the site created, what template was used on it, was there an extranet user manager group for external access to it as part of it, when was it last modified, all that kind of information. Now, as an end user requesting a site, of course, I don't want to have to care about all that sort of detail. And this is why we use Power Apps to customize the form here. So if I come back, let me just unselect that one item and say I want to create a new list item in here. I'll take you through the end user experience first, and then I'll show you behind the scenes. So we see a very simple form came up here. It doesn't have nearly all the fields that we saw on the list. It only has the ones that matter from what we want to capture from the end user's point of view. So what's the site that you want to create? Let's just call it Webinar Demo 1. We'll be very creative. And what site template do we want to use? Well, we've got a couple choices here. We could create a classic team site, which is the old style of team sites. It won't create an Office 365 group. It'll just create the team site itself. I can create a modern communication site. That's actually the one that I'm going to choose, but I'll come back to that in a second. I can create a modern team site. This is the one that's actually going to create the whole Office 365 group as part of it. But we also have this one that you don't normally see there, a modern client site. And basically that's one that we've taken the modern team site and we've customized and tweaked it to the way Envision IT likes to work from a client site point of view. So we've got particular libraries and folders and structure that we have as part of that. Actually, in fact, why don't I go through that process? Even though I didn't dry run it, we'll hope for the best from that point of view. Now, normally I would put in a URL for the site, but because this is based on a modern team site, it's going to create an Exchange group as part of this. I actually need to give it an alias, and this will become the email alias for the group mailbox. We'll call it Webinar Demo 1. And I want to tell it what parent URL to use, so I'll use temp demos. I'm going to leave the extranet user manager for now, and we can come back to that later and talk more about that. So let me go ahead and save that. So you can see it just added that new item to the list there. Now, the second step of the process is that there's a Microsoft flow that's going to run. So let's come back to our flows here. So if I look at my flows, I'm logged into Flow, which is part of Office 365. We can see we've got this flow here. This is when an item is created, create site. So let's actually look at the details of that. Let's edit this particular flow. So it's got 4 steps that it goes through. It starts with saying, okay, I want to watch a particular list. And this address here is that list that we were just looking at, the landing list in, or sorry, the sites list in the landing site. So anytime something new gets created in there, this flow is going to launch off. And the first thing it's going to do is call out to an Azure function to say, go create the site. This is where the heavy lifting happens. There's a basically an interface where you can publish your PowerShell scripts to run in Azure, and you can connect them up as a custom connector into Flow. I'm not going to go into all the details because it gets fairly technical on how that happens. I have a couple of webinars from back in the spring that go into much more detail on that, so have a look at the events page to see those. And the white paper that I mentioned goes into great detail as to how to wire that together. But suffice it to say that when this step runs, it's actually going to go and create the site. And it's going to send me an email to say, hey, somebody just requested and received a site, and it's going to send an email to the person that requested it. Excuse me. And you can see Flow is very much a drag and drop interface. You know, I've configured this flow to say, hey, I want to send the email to the person that created the original request to their email address. And I want to tell them the title of the site that they requested as part of the subject of that email. So you can actually build out the format of the email through this here. And if back here before the create site, I wanted to say add an approval, I can add an action or a condition in there and actually go through a whole approval process as part of that. So Flow is quite flexible from that point of view. So let me go back here. I'm not going to actually save any changes to that flow. What I do want to do is look here. You can see that flow ran 2 minutes ago. So that was the item that I just created. And I can actually see the details as it came through there. Actually, that's orange. That looks like we had did a retry. For some reason, it didn't succeed the first time. It actually did a second try on it. So Flow will put some error handling in there. If there's problems, retry it from there. So let's actually look back at our list. Let me just refresh it. And you can see that webinar demo 1 that we created, now it has a whole bunch more columns filled in. You know, the site was created. This is still set on Pacific time, so it's showing it just before 10:30 Pacific time. Through there, we've got our whole breadcrumb that's been built out based on the parent URL that's been filled in. We can see it was based off of a modern client site. So actually, let's have a look at that site itself. I'm just going to open that up in a new tab. And there's our new site. You know, one of the coolest things that that Microsoft did was when they launched modern sites, they had an engineering goal of saying, we want sites to be able to be created within a 5-second period of time. So they wanted the ability to request and receive a site to be very, very quick. And they've actually done a really good job of that. They generally stay within that boundary through there. So this is based off of a modern team site, but remember I picked the Envision IT client site template as part of that. So if we look at the site contents over on the side here, you know, I've got things like client documents as well as my regular documents. We've actually created some additional libraries in through here. You know, we've put some folders in as part of those as well. So we've got some structure around that above and beyond what comes out of the box from a standard team site. So basically the way that we do that is we keep an empty site as our template. We modify that, we add any additional libraries, any content types, site columns, things like that to that site. And we can then snapshot that and say, that is now a template. And the provisioning process can use the definition of that site and apply it to any new sites that it creates. Then over time, maybe your template needs to change. You can go back to that original site, tweak it a little bit, snapshot a new template from it, and there's your new template going forward. You can even apply that new template to existing sites the patterns and practices, Microsoft code that we're using as part of that, will actually apply those changes as best it can. It won't remove things that you've removed from the template because it doesn't know if you've put stuff in there in each of your client sites, but it will do best efforts to add anything new in that you've added to the template from there. So it becomes a very flexible way of managing that going forward. All right, so let's come back to our deck for a second here and talk about what we've done from a Masthead integration point of view. Now, the first is Masthead actually publishes up some sample PowerShell, up on GitHub on how you can interface as a IT pro or a developer with Masthead. And they provide 4 functions that you can call through PowerShell to do that. So on an existing site, I can say I want to install Masthead to it, because if you remember at the beginning, I showed you the configuration where you either enabled or disabled Masthead on each site. By default, out of the box, when you create a new site, it doesn't have Masthead installed on it. You can also remove Masthead from a site that you previously installed it to, and you can have it flow through not just to the site, but to any of its subsites as well. Although we're getting away from subsites, generally not recommending to clients that they create those. So what we've done is in the site provisioning script, we actually call out to that installed a site as part of the process. So if I come back to my webinar demo that we've got here, this is the brand new site that we just created through that process. You'll notice that I've got my Masthead navigation here in the site already. I didn't need to do anything. You know, we assume as the site provisioning, when you request a site, you're going to want the global navigation on there. So we go ahead and do the install to it from there. Because that's all part of scripts that you control, your IT administrators that are managing that process, you know, you may have situations where you do or you don't want Masthead on the site. It could actually become part of the form as a checkbox, do I want the global navigation or not, and it could make the appropriate choice, or it could be based on the templates. That some templates you do want Masthead, some templates you don't. You can really build up your own logic from there. So if we come back to that Power Apps form for a minute here, so this is the list that we made the request in. Let me just uncheck that. Rather than going into the new and launching the form, I can actually come to Power Apps here and say Customize Forms. This is how we actually created this form in the first place. So Power Apps is a form builder. It's part of Office 365. All of the licenses provide the ability to build and consume forms that are created through it. So it's basically setting up the designer now for the form for me. So we can see there's the form that I saw. So let's say I wanted to add a checkbox to decide whether to put Masthead in the site or not. You know, I would simply define a new list in a new field in the list to store that, and then add it into the form from here. I could then publish that up, and that would become part of the provisioning process. So it's up to you to define how you want that to work. Power Apps is intended as a power user tool. I'm a little on the fence still. It's fairly technical, so it's almost more of a developer type of tool, but it's certainly something someone within your organization could run with to not only create the initial forms, but modify and morph them from there as well. I'm not going to bother publishing those changes. So that was for the first piece. It's just when a new site gets created, let's provision a script out as part of that. So we took you through a demo of that. What I want to do now is talk more about the customizations. So in addition to some PowerShell scripts that you can download from GitHub and call out to interact with Masthead, you can actually inject your own JavaScript into Masthead itself. So this is something that they just launched. It became available in the last release that came out last week or end of the week before, so it's quite new. And basically what happens is Masthead looks for a file called mastheadscript.js. You put it in the site assets, your root site collection, and there's a function in there that gets called whenever the nav renders. And basically you can attach your own code in there to customize what that looks like. So let's have a look first where that is. So if we come back to our site, if I go up to my root site and site assets, oops, I didn't quite get that right. So we can see here this file, mastheadscript.js is our own file that we put in there. It has the customizations that we want to do as part of that. We also have a Masthead folder, so we've got a couple of assets like the logos that we see here and some CSS that we're applying as part of that styling. So let's actually go back to our webinar demo site that we've created there. So if I come down into sales, this is where the global navigation becomes important. Remember, I said its parent was temporary demo sites. What we've done on this site here is we've actually put a web part in here that we've created that uses that same list to say, hey, get all the sites that live underneath this particular site and show them up in a list here. Now we're not actually seeing the, oh no, we are. That's the webinar demo one that we created right there. So if I click on that link, it'll take me to that site. Okay. So what have we done from the out of the box? Well, one of the things that we've noticed in modern sites is we're not a huge fan of the search experience in there. The modern search hasn't really caught up with what you could do from a classic point of view. So we've actually taken the out of the box search box out and we've dropped our own customized search box in here. Now we're just kind of taking over functionality. One of the things we wanted was a drop down here to be able to define where we want to go from a search point of view. So by default, it's left at this site, which actually behaves exactly the same as the out-of-the-box search experience. But I can also point it to documents, people, and everything as part of that as well. So let's say I take it to everything, and I type in the word SharePoint, which is always a safe search on our site. You notice it actually took me out of SharePoint Online, and it took me over to www.office.com, because that's actually got a nice search experience as part of that. So here's all the search results coming back from that, all that I chose. I can actually drill that down and say, well, I'm actually looking for documents. You know, I can start to use the filtering to say, hey, I'm looking for a PowerPoint that was done in the past week. You know, and we can start to see some of the documents that are coming back from that. So there's actually quite a nice interface to go through those search results from that point of view. If I come back to my webinar demo page, we've also put our logo in here. Now we've got our logo in a couple of different places. We should probably choose one to put it in. Like Alec did, I wanted to illustrate different concepts here. So Masthead natively allows us to drop a logo in right here in the top left. Now we run two brands. We have an Envision IT and an Extranet User Manager brand. So I wanted to show both of those logos in as part of that. I could merge them together into one big wide logo and stick it over here, but it might start crowding the navigation from that point of view. I learned a new tidbit from Alec's webinar last week is that we can actually override this logo here where it says Office 55 and put ours in there as well. You know, that's maybe something we want to do because it would show up not just in SharePoint, but across the whole site. So this isn't terribly pretty. We've done it more from a functional point of view, but I wanted to give you a sense of what's possible here. So basically, everything in this area here, we've taken the out of the box out and we put our own in. So we could put some background coloring in there. We could put different images in as part of that. We can get quite creative with what we do there. There are some caveats to be aware of. This all renders at client side time. So when I do a refresh on here, you can see there's the old header in there and boom, it then redraws and puts in the masthead and our custom from there. Unfortunately, there's no way to avoid that. I mean, that is how client-side rendering works, is that the page needs to load, the JavaScript needs to fire, and then it gets rendered from there. One of the things that we are hoping for from Microsoft is the ability to predefine the space that we need for what we're inserting in there, just so things don't jump up and down. Because right now, if I refresh the page, and I put my mouse over something here, you see how everything shifts down. It can get a little confusing clicking on things from that point of view. So we're keen to see if we'll see any announcements next week on that side there. That would make this style of extensions, which are called SharePoint Framework extensions, that much nicer from a usability point of view. Now, the other thing that we added in here is the breadcrumb. So remember when we were in the list, if I come back to my, my landing site list here, let's actually pull up the full view of that list again. So every site in here has a breadcrumb that's been calculated. So as part of the provisioning process, it looks at the parent URL and it walks up that tree to build out the whole hierarchy of where that belongs. So what we do on the site itself when we're into the page is we actually do a search query back to that list and say, get me the breadcrumb for the particular site that I'm on right now. So we can actually display that breadcrumb and give people a sense of where are they in the hierarchy of the sites. And these are all clickable, so I can click on any of those to go any of those levels from there. I can go into the temporary demos, back to that landing page that we were looking at. I can come back and I can see the same breadcrumb there. I can click back into webinar demo 1 and see where I fit in the hierarchy here. Even if we go deeper, if I go down into the documents library, you can see we append that library that we're in into that. And if I go even further from here, let me create a folder within that library. Go ahead and open that up. So we see the whole site hierarchy, and then the document library, and then the folder that I'm in. One of the things I like to do is often send people links, not just to the particular documents, but to the folder or the library where I want people to look to do things. I can actually just right click on that, copy that link address, and now I've got an easy way to navigate straight into that folder within that library, within that site, and see that whole hierarchy as part of that there. So it becomes a very powerful tool from understanding where this content fits into the overall structure of the site, something that's been lacking with the out of the box. I mean, they give you a little bit of a breadcrumb here, but it only takes you back up to the library level, not up through that hierarchy of sites. So that's really it there. We've added in our script file here. There's a function that gets called when the nav is ready. We drop our logos in there, we change the search box, and we build out the breadcrumb with a little bit of client-side calls back to that list to figure out what the parent URL properties are. So that's really it. I told people, we're going to cut it a little short today because the topic's less than an hour. I got a couple of wrap-up points that I want to go through from there. I just want to circle back to the extranet user manager side of things. I didn't get a chance to get it in the demo side, but I want to explain how this can fit together from that perspective as well. So let's start by going back to our list and requesting a new site. I mentioned these two fields we'd come back to later. We have the ability as part of the provisioning process to not just create a site, but actually create a group. Now, this isn't an Office 365 group. This is a group in our extranet user manager product intended for you to invite external people in to collaborate with you on the site. So you can name a group for that. It could be the same name as the site itself, could be something different, and you can define whether they want read or contribute access into the site from there. What's going to happen when I provision this site, once it's all wired and running together, is not only does it create the site, but it also then creates the extranet user manager group and applies the appropriate permissions to that. And if we look back at our structure of our demo site that we created here, we've got things like client documents versus the regular documents library. We can do things like only provide contribute access into the client documents for those external clients, whereas staff would have access to all the things through here. The other thing that we do as part of that is if we think about the roll-up pages that I was showing, and it's showing the list of sites. These are temporary demo sites that I've created, but imagine that this is a landing page for those external people to come in. In addition to setting permissions to the sites, we can set permissions to each of these list items in here as well. So when I log in as an external person, I only see the sites that I have permissions to. This becomes a quick way to guide people into the right spot within their site from there. Now, the last thing that I want to point out is on the navigation itself, we can actually security trim that. So right now we're seeing the full staff complement of features in the navigation. We wouldn't want to expose that to external people. So what we would typically do is we have an existing group called staff. We can security trim all of these nav items to that staff group. So only staff see these items. And then we can create a group that only the external people belong to say, add a single home navigation in here. So that when they log in, they don't see all this nav, they just see a home that takes them to this page here. They can get into one or more of the sites that they have access to, and away they go from there. So we can have a very personalized experience from a navigation point of view, whether I'm an external person or a staff member. Even the breadcrumbs we can tailor to say, hey, maybe if you don't belong to that staff group, we shouldn't show you the breadcrumbs, because if you're down in this webinar demo 1 site, we don't want you to have the ability to click on the sales or the home, because those aren't places that you should be going, and you're going to get an access denied if you try and go there anyways. We should just remove those from the visibility of that. So we can actually morph how we present that breadcrumb depending on who the user is. So just wrapping up from here, I've touched on Office 365 groups. You know, in this session, we didn't want to go too deep into what they are. We do have past sessions if you go into our events section that go deeper on that side of things, but they are a great way to manage projects. Now, it can be a little overwhelming for a lot of organizations. There's a lot of different products as part of Office 365 group. If you think about that diagram I was showing you earlier, you don't have to start with everything. You can pick and choose what makes sense for your organization. The key thing, though, is to have some guidance and some standards. You know, you've got a lot of different tools available like Yammer and Outlook and Microsoft Teams that have a lot of crossover with each other. So you want to make sure that you're using a single tool for the project. You've got everybody on board using the same way of communicating from that point of view. Do be prepared for change. I mean, almost everybody was already in Office 365, so I'm sure you're aware of this. Office 365 does change very quickly. There's new things coming out all the time. There is a roadmap that Microsoft publishes out. There's going to be lots of announcements next week from a Microsoft Ignite point of view. So coming back to my earlier point, you know, decide the conversation format that makes sense for your teams. You know, are you using Outlook? Are you using Yammer? Are you using Microsoft Teams? And put your governance plan in place. Make sure you got the right training, the right guidance for your users as to how they should be using the system. Think about your external user policy. A lot of folks want to just shut down all the external sharing and not allow that at all. The reality is people will find their own way. They'll use email attachments, they'll use Dropbox, they'll use FTP sites. You know, so it's best if you can support it in a well-governed, well-managed way within your Office 365. You know, figure out what your information architecture looks like to support that, what your site templates should be. Look at building out a provisioning process. So I had all the links earlier in the deck that show you where all the source code, the white paper, everything is about that whole side of things. Just going to flip back to the browser for a second here, coming back to the EUM site. So if you come down into events, this is the session I'm delivering today. We're going to update this event page with the recording and the deck. Last week's session from Alec is already up there. You can watch the video, you can view the presentation from there. And coming up on Thursday, we're going to have a session from the folks at tyGraph, so noon to 1 Eastern time. They're going to talk about the whole analytics side of things. So how do we build a nice Power BI dashboard that looks at how your Office 365 is being used across all the different product workloads. So they've done some really cool things from that point of view. So tune in. If you've registered for this one, you're automatically registered for the next one as well. There is a calendar invitation within the GoToWebinar. You can add that to your calendar quite easily. So from there, I just want to say thank you. Glad you were able to join us this afternoon. Hope you found value there. If you've got questions, we've been keeping the questions open. I don't think we've got anything to answer from there. Yeah, so there is Peter, a link to the webinar replay.
Sorry, Peter, Amanda? No unanswered questions, but I think Ed just wanted to say a few words of introduction to the next session.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. Actually, you did a pretty good job of introducing us, so I'll keep this very brief. But welcome to join us on Wednesday at noon Eastern Daylight Time to talk about Office 365 and mining data. We like to phrase it as mining data for gold. Looking at all the signals that are emanating from your Office 365 suite. Some people don't even know that they're there. So lots of good use cases, and we'll be looking forward to meeting you all at that session.
Great. Thanks, Ed. And thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.